The Tidal Basin is the premier spot in Washington, D.C. to see the world-famous cherry blossoms. And I've got a bunch of tips to help you have a great time. The first and most important of which is to temper your expectations. There are many, many amazing professional photos of the cherry blossoms in bloom around the Tidal Basin. And you have surely seen these as you've been researching a trip to DC. One thing that is not in many of these photos is people, which sets up quite an unrealistic expectation. It kind of reminds me in some ways of the expectations some people have when they go to the Louvre to look at the Mona Lisa. They plan to stand in front of it, admire it, think about what Leonardo da Vinci was thinking when he created it, and then they get there and the reality is massive crowds, huge lines, and a very different experience than what they were expecting. The good news here is that you're watching this video, which is a great way to help set correct expectations. By the way, hello, my name is Rob. I'm a tour guide and the founder of Trip Hacks DC Tours. On this channel, I share my best tips, tricks, and hacks for visitors who want to explore Washington, DC. And I'm curious to know, have you ever seen the world famous cherry blossoms on the Tidal Basin? Leave a comment down there and let me know what you thought. Now, the most important thing that you can do to set your expectations is prepare for heavy crowds. The month of the Cherry Blossom Festival is probably the single busiest period of the year in DC for tourism. And the Tidal Basin in particular gets especially crowded because everybody wants to come see the blossoms. So pretty much everywhere you go around the basin itself is going to be packed. That includes the Jefferson Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, and spaces in between. I'm not saying to use heavy crowds as an excuse not to come see the blossoms, but to make sure to know what to expect, because in my experience, misaligned expectations about crowds is what is most likely to lead to disappointment. That said, these next several tips will help you navigate the crowds. The heaviest crowds are usually midday. So one thing that you can do is to come early or come late. And when I say early, I mean early, at the crack of dawn, during sunrise. You're not going to find big hordes of tourists at this hour, but I will warn that you will find many people with professional photographers taking portraits. Photographers want to take advantage of the morning golden hour, and they know that there aren't going to be a lot of tourists around, so expect to dodge some cameras. And even though it will be a different experience, there's nothing that says you can't come see the blossoms after dark. Sunset on April 1st is at 7:30, and the heaviest crowds tend to clear out once the sun goes down. The blossoms might not photograph quite as well in the dark, but to your eye, they will still look quite stunning. Another tip for avoiding the heaviest crowds is to not be afraid of an overcast day or even a rainy day. A large chunk of people on any given day down at the Tidal Basin looking at the blossoms are not necessarily tourists from out of town. They're people who live in or somewhat near Washington, D.C. And on a rainy day, a lot of those people will decide they'll just wait till tomorrow. So grab an umbrella and a raincoat and don't be afraid of a little rain. Now, let's talk about transportation tips for getting down to the Tidal Basin. The best way to get down to the Tidal Basin during cherry blossom season is on foot, followed by metro. The closest metro stations are Smithsonian and L'Enfant Plaza. I would suggest using Smithsonian if you're coming in on the orange, blue, or silver lines, and L'Enfant Plaza if you're coming in on green or yellow. And the worst transportation option is trying to drive your own car. Now, I personally like to get around on Capital Bike Share, but during cherry blossom season, you need to be careful because the docks near the Tidal Basin fill up quick. So use the Capital Bike Share app and make sure to check in advance that there will be a spot where you can lock up. Even though I personally don't care for e-scooters, I do know they're popular, especially with visitors. And if you're going to take one down to the National Mall or Tidal Basin, there are specific areas where you are allowed to end a ride. So make sure to check in the app of the scooter company that you're using to find those exact locations. Now, if at all possible, please do not try to drive your own car to the Tidal Basin during cherry blossom season. The Tidal Basin already has very limited public parking, and during the National Cherry Blossom Festival, they actually close some of the parking lots for festival events. So during this season, you have extremely high demand and reduced supply, and you can kind of see the issue. Plus, I have personally witnessed some of the worst gridlock and road rage during the cherry blossom season. And it seriously bums me out to see so many people angry, ragey, and stressed out during what should otherwise be a fun spring event. Now, my next tip for avoiding the heaviest crowds is to see the blossoms in East Potomac Park. Let's bust out a map so I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. This body of water right here is the Tidal Basin, and the famous Tidal Basin blossoms are in a ring around the water. To the southeast of the Tidal Basin is this big park called East Potomac Park. Some people call it Haynes Point, but technically Haynes Point is only the tip of the park down here. This park has a huge concentration of cherry blossoms, and they're just as beautiful as the ones around the Tidal Basin. Every year, I come here to see blossoms and am shocked that more people don't know about it. Now, one fun thing that a lot of people like to do during cherry blossom season is rent a paddle boat and see the blossoms from a different perspective. The paddle boat dock is on the east side of the Tidal Basin, just a short walk from the Washington Monument. If you do want to paddle during cherry blossom season, make a reservation in advance. Ideally, as far in advance as you can, because this is a really popular thing to do and there are only so many boats. My next tip is to look out for a few of my personal favorite gems in the area. The first is this little cherry tree we call Stumpy. Stumpy is located in an area that frequently floods during high tide, and the water has damaged Stumpy's roots. But despite the odds, Stumpy lives and blooms every year in the spring. Near the FDR Memorial is the Japanese pagoda. It was a gift from the mayor of Yokohama in the 1950s, and actually we don't really know that much about it other than that. And finally is the Japanese lantern, which is over 300 years old, and I think one of the oldest artifacts in Washington, D.C., or at least one of the oldest artifacts outside of a museum. It's located near the spot where the very first cherry tree was planted on the Tidal Basin over 100 years ago. And if you made it this far, I highly recommend watching one of my virtual cherry blossom walking tours, which you can do by clicking or tapping right over here. Enjoy your trip.